This is the last panel that we have in words and bits. You know, the section that we have been nurturing during these years to prove that games are connected to all arts, that we have great artists that excels in other arts as Hal, in cinema and in many things, that also has excelled in video games, and that they don't have, you know, any way to look down to games as an art form, as an art expression. So in this talk, we're going to explore how Hal Barwood was able to fulfill two success careers in both cinema and video games, and how he started to be interested in this media. And we are going to end with some gift that he just gave to me, that is his last book. That is a very interesting cross-media project, and we will talk about it, because I think it makes the cycle of this panel perfect. So I want to start with that beautiful story that you told during that interview the other day of BASIC. And I want you to talk about the first thing that you did in BASIC, because it's pretty surprising how many things we don't know of the origins of games.
Should I turn this around?
I don't know if it's going to work.
No,
No.
I'm just going to shout. Well, when I was a kid, I had two interests. One was games and one was movies. I grew up in a tiny town in the east coast of the United States, Hanover, New Hampshire, which is the home of Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College is where the computer language BASIC was invented. Now, my father ran the movie theater in the town of Hanover. And so when I was a kid, I was exposed to movies that influenced me throughout my life, like Citizen Kane and Red River and The Thing from Another World, especially. And then a little bit later, The Seventh Seal, Bergman's movie. All these had a profound influence on my tiny brain. But I also admired this weird ability of these machines to, apparently to a kid, to be able to start to think and start to become an other that we could sort of engage with. Except that in those days, you know, computers were programmed with punch cards at best. And only if you were a scientist in a white coat, you know, working around in some air-conditioned room with all these giant machines, could you hope to get near a computer. But so eventually what happened to me, I went to university, and then I found out I could go to graduate school and learn how to make movies. So I journeyed from the east coast of the United States to California, and I went to the University of Southern California studying movies. And after my first year there, I went back to Hanover, and I discovered that John Kemeny and Thomas Kurtz had invented this computer language called BASIC at Dartmouth, which allowed anybody who wanted to learn this rather simple interpretive language and go sit down at one of the university's teletype machines and learn to program. And of course, the very first thing that I programmed was paper, rock, scissors. So later, I also eventually did a program where I put in just a whole series of words. Matthew Robbins, my writing partner, and I had written a movie which never quite got made called Various Things, but I know it as Home Free. But the reason the title occurred is other people have heard of it and they call it Star Dancing. But the reason why it's called either of those things is because I wrote a BASIC program with just a database full of all sorts of words. And I wrote a program which put the words together in pairs. And then we looked through the list and we thought, hey, look, Home Free. And hey, look, Star Dancing. So that's the beginnings of my involvement with computers. This is 1964. And it was 15 years later that computers started to invade people's homes, and I could actually get going on what I wanted to do. And of course, when I was a kid, I was building games from an early age. And when I was in high school, I was building games. My friends, I built an electric football game so that all the interactions were occurring with little switches and little jacks. And my friends loved that thing. But I didn't want to spend a career doing what in those days we called paper games, board games and stuff like that. So I followed my interest in movies for many years, and even after I started doing real games, movies came back to haunt me, and I wound up directing a movie right in the middle of when I was trying to become a video game designer. So anyway, that's kind of how programming got going for me, and it was very early. So.
Let's talk about that epiphany moment, in your best moment as a producer, and because I think that's a beautiful story to see the change of mind of your work in place.
Every now and then you get hit over the head with an important tip about life. It happened to me when Matthew and I were making a movie called Dragon Slayer. I think here it's called the Lake of Fire.
Sí, El Dragón del Lago de Fuego.
Yeah. And I think we're going to see a clip of it tonight around midnight. Anyway, among the various things, it's a costume piece, and it involves an Iron Age kingdom and a dragon that's tormenting all the citizens of that place. Well, at one point we needed to build an Iron Age village with thatched roofs and shoot it all in moonlight. We needed to have a dance, an Iron Age dance, which we had to choreograph with hundreds of extras in order to celebrate the demise of the dragon. At least they thought it was dead. And we needed to have a dramatic scene where a young man who's avoiding this lottery to appease the dragon is now revealed as a woman. And then we had to have a dragon come through, which would eventually appear via industrial light and magic's visual effects, to light all the thatched roofs on fire. And so a lot of this was happening at night, so we had these big towers with what are called 10K lights that are up there producing moonlight. And it was very difficult to get this all arranged. Now my job, Matthew and I wrote together, and my job was to be the producer, and Matthew was the director. So what I was supposed to do was bring all the goods and services to the set. And once the towers were up and the 10Ks were lit and there was jellied gasoline in the thatched huts, and we had been rehearsing the dancing, and we made sure that all these people clad in burlap didn't have wristwatches or glasses or running shoes on, that kind of stuff. And I discovered that what should have been one of the highlights of my life, to watch Matthew turn all this material into a wonderful dramatic scene and an exciting set of moments from the movie. And I found that I would have much more fun if I retreated into my trailer all by myself. And in those days, this is 1980, I had an HP 41C calculator, which was the first little calculator that would do some alphabetic stuff on its display. And I taught that calculator sitting in my trailer. Matthew's off making the movie, and I'm sitting in the trailer, and I'm making a version of, a Dragon Slayer version of Hunt the Wumpus. Well, I thought about that, and I realized that if that was the case, that if I would rather sit in a trailer by myself and program something, instead of being out there watching this terrific moment, very expensive and wonderful thing to see, my own work and Matthew's work coming to life, that I was in the wrong business. That was in 1980. And it took me 10 years, but I eventually became a professional game designer.
So tell us about the moment that you called yours and you decided to ask him if you could join his team, and what is your impression of Lucasarts those days? You were in, because I didn't remember of our long interview, you were in Skywalker Ranch for a time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a different vision, because most of the people there were younger than you at that moment, and were his first job. They were unexperienced doing stuff, and you were with a different background. So I want to know that first moment that you meet, all the guys, Grossman, Tim Safer, and what was your impression of the place?
What did I think of Skywalker? Well, I'll just tell you in general. So by the time I had made games on my own. I taught myself how to do 6502 assembly language. I could torture that damn processor into doing all sorts of weird tricks, and I built a complicated RPG called Space Snatchers. If you go to my website, which is either halbarwood.com or finitearts.com, my little company, all that stuff is still there. You can go play it right now, an Apple II game that you can play on Windows 10. And anyway, it looks like an Apple II game, I'll tell you, but it's very, very complicated. It'll take you forever to get through it. And in those days, of course, we all had, back in those early days of computer games, we had a very serious idea about how games should be difficult, so get ready. Anyway, so I was 40 when I had that epiphany in my trailer in the outskirts of London, and it took 10 years, and I was 50 when I joined Lucasarts. Some guys that later became my good pals, Noah Falstein, David Fox, and Ron Gilbert, who had made a previous Jones game based on the Last Crusade movie. They were very tired out by that. It was my first hint that it was hard to build video games. And anyway, they wanted someone else to come in. They could go off and do other projects. And they knew about me because George Lucas, who owned that company, and I are pals. I've known George for half a century. We went to film school together. And so they knew of my interest in games, and they tapped me on the shoulder to come and do the Fate of Atlantis. Well, it didn't start out as the Fate of Atlantis. But anyway, those guys, we all were out at Skywalker Ranch, a wonderful country area. It looks like the outskirts of Madrid, actually. And anyway, this fancy restaurant, ranch that George built. And we were there for about 6 months. And it was really neat. I'm meeting a lot of guys who are in the business, their first jobs out of school. They have no idea how to work. But meanwhile, I'm a fairly mature adult with a kid inside, and it's not my first job. So that was interesting to watch. It was also interesting to notice right away that in the movie business, everyone is a skilled professional. So let's say you want Vilmos Zsigmond to be your director of photography, and my God, you can't get him, so you want Dean Cundy. You can't get him, so you get Frank Stanley. And you know what? This guy who's in the third tier is an ultra pro. And so is everybody else on your crew. But in the game business, that's not at all. It's very, very rare that you have half a crew that actually really know what they're doing. And that's probably still true today. So anyway, all these kids in their first job was very interesting because they all became lifelong friends of mine. And it's also interesting because I had children just about their age. Now they're all 50 years old, but in those days they were all 40 years old. And of course, I have completely different relationships. You know, with my kids, it's like, don't talk to your mother like that. And with my friends from the game business, it's like, hey, you know, let's hang out, and it's just, you know, like regular friends. So anyway, that's the story. But I found that Skywalker Ranch, I'd also been there previously with Matthew. We had offices there for a while writing. And then I went back to work there, and I found it very, very distracting. I would look out the window, and there'd be deer eating the agapanthus outside the window, and every now and then on the sidewalk, a bobcat would come walking along, an American lynx, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, and people were seeing eagles flying overhead, and every now and then people would see a mountain lion. So, and it was very hard in this idyllic country area to get any work done for me. I prefer to be in a tiny cubby hole and it's all dark and I can just work. So we got kicked out of Skywalker because the company became fairly successful. And we moved to a bunch of offices near Industrial Light and Magic in a place called San Rafael, California, which is near San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. I think something that everyone in these rooms wants to know of that date, one side is the impression that that age of adventure games was something very significant for the medium, not only in that moment, but in the future, for inspiration to many game designers. And the other thing that everyone wants to know always about LucasArts, and as you know, I have been doing a lot of job for the book investigating that, is why it fell apart. And that is related with Steve Arnold and all the guys going. So I think that those two topics are very interesting to touch.
I can talk about that a little bit. When I started, Ron Gilbert had just finished, or was about to publish, Monkey Island, one of my all-time favorite games. And meanwhile, he went off and did the second Monkey Island. Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman were busy starting to do their games. The two guys that worked with me, Sean Clark and Mike Stemley, went off to do their games, Sam and Max. And so there was a period of time when adventure games flourished at Lucasarts. But Lucasarts was getting bigger. And there was a period of time about then, so you have to remember this is like 1990, so we're almost 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at that point, an artist would much rather go down the road a block and work for Industrial Light and Magic than he would like to work for a game company. It was considered really low rent to work for games. And that started to change. And over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, I guess, artists started to realize that, you know, there's really a future in these games. They're going to be becoming more prominent, and part of that was the immense success that we had. But it was all very primitive, and the games were kind of visually abstract. Fate of Atlantis was the very first game at LucasArts which used as many as 256 colors. And it was also the second game that ever had, that ever had a character that could move in the Z-axis. You know, it gets smaller when it went into VR. You know, oh my God. And Fate was also the very first game we did that had a voice track, an audio track, which is part of the reason why it was very, very successful. It was a harbinger of the future. But things were changing, and we were doing very well for a while, and the company was expanding. And a lot more people came in whose first job it was, and their tastes began to change. And gradually, over a period of time, the population of the company had very few people interested in adventure games, and many more people interested in being Darth Vader in Star Wars shooters. And because of that, the company switched its emphasis. When we were doing adventure games, and I have to say, to this day, Fate of Atlantis was by far the biggest seller of all those games. Probably the biggest seller of that period, or a little bit later, were Vince Lee's Rebel Assault games, which were Area 51, you know, shooters where things pop up and you knock them down. Great mechanic. I still play Area 51 with my PlayStation pistol controller. Anyway, these people were interested in this sort of thing, and the result of this, we started to make money. And so that became the emphasis. And not only that, the world's audiences started to change, and adventure games started to fall out of favor as 3D came in and other things started to advance the technology. And so the adventure games kind of became passé. We were doing very well financially, but I thought the soul had gone out of the company. And I'm a little bit like that legendary frog in hot water. You know, if you suddenly boil the water, the frog jumps out. But if the water slowly gets hot, you cook him. I got cooked. And so that's what happened.
I think it's very interesting that many of you told me that, you know, things like Doom, especially Doom, changed the whole thing and switched the games to violence and action is the first. And that, you know, it wasn't too good for the industry because it became something that was financially success, but changed very much and attract bad press to the medium because there is only images of violence for so many times and not other things. And if you look at 80s, 90s, 70s, that was not the case at all on games. So comment a little bit on that, because adventure games were narrative and other things that are not at all violence were very funny, very attractive, and attract an audience.
All true. And when Doom happened, it was a revolution. It ran through our company like a firestorm. And we all got interested in that stuff. And we eventually managed to figure out ways to do versions of that involving Star Wars that became hits. And so that was part of why we were doing very well financially. I'm interested in adventure games, and especially adventure games where there's a little bit of action in there, because they have very strong narratives. You know, I'm not so interested in the idea of nonlinearity, although I've done some of it, quite a bit of it actually. But life is nonlinear, you know, and as my friend Jesse Schell says, you know, the little poster, a guy staring out a window looking very morose, life, worst game ever. So I believe in that, and I believe that one of the charms of games and narrative in all its forms is the fact that there is a strong flow from point A to point B, and there's resolution, and there's a way to understand how events and how they impact you. And so I'm very interested in that stuff. But I guess when the shooters started to happen, it turned the game business on its head. And when we were doing adventure games, you didn't worry so much about hits, because almost anything you did would make money. And then once the shooter world took over, it became hit-driven. Now, financially, there's nothing wrong with shooting. Take a look at Fortnite. At its height, it was making $200 million a month. No movie has ever done anything like that. So the world has changed, but it is hit-driven. And just like the movie business, you can spend a fortune on a game and it just goes down the tank and you never hear about it again. And so it's a dangerous business, and it's much more dangerous now than it was, you know, when I started. Mm-hmm. And it's also grimmer. You know, I still love games, I play them. But to be honest with you, the games that I like are kind of games that are either made by independents, you know, the indie game scene, or studios that have a charter to do odd things. So, for example, I'm a big fan of the game Eco, which is a game from quite a few years ago, but with a very strong narrative and wonderful emotional content.
For me to wear the first game, it's amazing.
And I also like crazy games like, you know, Katamari Damacy, roll up the universe, and recently games like Journey. I don't know if you've ever seen that, or another game, my favorite of the last few years. It's not just a puzzle game; is a game called Firewatch, which is a terrific experience of being out in a forest and alone in the summer with radio contact with someone who's going to turn out to be your next love. Anyway, that's kind of my reaction.
So I'm going to blow up one of the surprises of my book. You know, you told me about the adventure game that you were preparing, just following Green Fandango, a Star Wars game. Well, can you tell the audience that? Because I think it's an amazing story.
I also preface this by saying, if you guys don't know about this, my writing partner, Matthew and I wrote movies together for 15 years. But I wanted to go and do games. I also wanted to direct a movie, which I did, and Matthew just wanted to keep going in the movie business. And so we parted ways professionally, but he's still a dear pal. And he still writes scripts. And I've got every single one he's written. I read them all and offer my cryptic advice. And the problem is that about 1 out of 10 of those gets made. And the problem is the screenplay is that no one wants to read the screenplay, really. It's just a question of can it get up there on the screen. So it's very frustrating. And one of the things I loved about the video game business, and still love, was that when I moved into video games, I could become productive. Almost everything I thought up got made. And that was really cool. The problem is that not everything got made. And so I still have some grudges. The wonderfully talented Tim Schafer, who has made a lot of wonderful games. Now he's got a company called Double Fine, he's made some wonderful games there. He's also sponsoring other people building games. I can't wait to play Knights and Bikes. And he got bought by Microsoft. So he's doing very well. But he couldn't get his work done. And he was making a game called Grim Fandango. It's a wonderful game. It was a failure commercially, unfortunately. Like a lot of stuff late in the adventure game period, this stuff started to not do so well. But he was using up all the company's resources. Meanwhile, I was preparing a game. It was called The New Emperor, a Star Wars game, and the hero, a perfect hero for an adventure game, the bumbling C-3PO. He becomes a spy because they're worried that you can't send a Jedi. The dark side Siths will recognize the Force, and you can't do your work. So 3PO gets selected to go off, and it's just a great idea. And I was very excited about it. But the company started to look at the bills coming in for Grim Fandango, which wasn't getting done, and I got canceled. So instead of doing that, I had another idea. Long before there was such a thing as casual games, I got very frustrated by the idea of playing for 120 hours through an RPG or even 20 hours through a complicated adventure game, because I think a lot of people would like an experience that's more akin to sitting in, watching a movie, for a couple of hours, or going to a soccer match and getting out of there after a couple of hours. And we couldn't do that, and economically you couldn't really do that in games, because in order to be able to get people to pay the insane amounts of money to buy a game, which is like 20 bucks then, 60 bucks now, you had to provide a lot of entertainment. And I thought that was terrible. So I wanted people to be able to buy something and play it and then put it away, and if they were interested, play it again. So I invented a way to do replayable action-adventure games. And it was the prototype that I made, and it was on an Apple with a program called HyperCard. And I tortured that thing into being able to play an interactive video game and showed it around. And what I wanted to do was a game called Tools of the Tinker's Trade, which was a game where it's kind of apocalyptic, and you have to go around and assemble a bunch of tools to get a lot of stuff done and solve all the problems of the world. And but in order to get the game made, the company didn't want to spend any money, and they wanted to get Microsoft to do it. And Microsoft said, "Oh, sure, as long as it's Indiana Jones." Well, eventually we decided. The company got encouraged by that, and the jerk who was running the company then, I won't mention his name, said, "Okay, well, we'll do it ourselves, but it has to be Jones." Well, casual games didn't exist, and this is a little tile-based game. It's about, on Windows 10, it's like that big. But in those days, when everybody had 800 by 600 screens, it was, but it was a little window that popped up, and it was quite abstract, but wonderful. And you had like 15 different scenarios of Jones as a younger man in Mexico running around and, finding stuff and worrying about bad guys of various kinds, and Nazis and their allies. And it was replayable. Once you're done, it would take about 40 minutes. It would build a little world abstractly with lots of clever rules so that you could have blockades and bridges and all sorts of puzzles that would match up algorithmically. And I got just terrible reviews because the magazines at that time, which did reviews, hated the idea of the sort of retro idea of tiles, and they hated the idea that Indiana Jones would be stuck in a tile. Anyway, but I love that game. And then I realized that I could make it even better, so I did a game which you can still play. Go up to my website, you can pull it down, you don't even have to install it, called Yoda Stories. And that's a really neat game. And it's the same kind of thing, where you have about 15 scenarios, but every time you play one, it's a different experience. It's not different radically in the sense that in one place you go to planet A over here, and it's like, wow, there are, mermaids over there, and then you go to another planet and it's just like, trolls or something like that. But it's more like the variability you find in chess, where you have all the same pieces and the same 64 squares, but each game is different, and it's kind of like that. Anyway, that's it.
But it's amazing because you were invented a roguelike genre, very, very early. So
yeah, Rogue could do it too, because it was also tiles, except they were little letters.
So you were surprised when you see in indie games this kind of ideas pop up in the last few years, because procedural game design and procedural game level design might be you seeing that those ideas that you have executed so early get done today.
Well, the other thing that happened, which I think is really interesting, is that eventually the idea of a casual game where you play it for maybe 45 minutes or an hour and then put it away and maybe look at it again sometime, those games, PopCap, all those games started to come out a few years after I did these two little story games that I did. And casual games, though, revolutionized another thing, which is that after a long period of quiescence, when there just weren't any adventure games, now they're back. They're back as casual games. Most of them are made, I guess, in Poland. Artifex Mundi is one of the companies there. G5, I think, is there. So coming out of Czestochowa are all these adventure games. And my wife, who doesn't play most games, just won't let me play any adventure game without her. And we've played a couple dozen of these things. And they're distinguished by kind of rickety stories that don't really quite work. Usually they're involving some rather beautiful woman in terrible trouble with some grandfather who's disappeared into the jungle. And they're casual, they're easy to do, but they have usually very, very beautiful graphics. And they're just point-and-click adventures. They're not as complicated as our old classic adventures are. A friend of mine who writes some of this stuff refers to modern adventure games as interactive stories with speed bumps. And that's kind of it. But they're a lot of fun, and we do them a lot. Now, my friend Ron Gilbert has made an attempt to bring back much more classic kind of adventure game. And I don't know if you guys have looked at Thimbleweed Park, which I've, of course, played through. It's just like the old ones. It's unbelievably hard, head-scratching puzzles that take you forever. But it's cool, and it's also very retro. It's all 8-bit graphics. So, anyway, I think that Ron is very frustrated. I don't think his game has been able to penetrate the market very well, and I don't know what he'll do now to follow up on that. But I think the trend is that adventure games live on in the form of casual games.
There is something, this is kind of a hard question, but it worries me so much when I was doing the book and interviewing all the brilliant minds that were there in the adventure game age. In a business like literature or movies, you have people with very long careers that are important for the industry during half a century. Steven Spielberg, for example, and many, but not only Eastwood, but not only these guys, but also the DP, the professionals can have long careers. But there is many of you that are not being integrated or used by the industry now that could do great stuff in the industry now. So why in games this continuity of careers that in some cases, I have one of the art directors of Monkey Island, when I did the interview to him, asked me for a job because he was in a very, very, very dangerous economical situation. And I can understand that. So what happened is in the game industry that you don't value the talent and experience when, of course, people that has experience can do the work better and can also advise new people better.
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is that, of course, movies are now 100 years old. And, you can look at, I guess the earliest movie that I would look at that I wouldn't look at simply for historical reasons, like I'm a researcher, would be a movie called It Happened One Night by Frank Capra. Came out in about 1935. When you watch it today, it just looks like it's today. And so movies have matured, 3 or 4 generations ago. And so that's part of the reason why there's professional expertise that goes on and on. Also, movies have to be made quickly. It's a little bit like military stuff when you're making a movie, and so people have to be good at their jobs. Otherwise, you just can't be in the business. And so people value experience. And also in movies, everyone is a freelancer. Almost nobody works for any particular company. And the word gets around. If some DP has been out there and he had to deal with one of those cameras that's on multiple strings before the era of drones, and you're flying over some baseball diamond, with this camera, and he will develop some ideas about how to make that work right. The steel cables are elastic, so the camera's bobbing. So he'll tell the next guy who has to do it, the next guy who's got to do something like that will call him up. And he will say, okay, well listen, make sure the angle's wide because that conceals the bobbing, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the world of games, everybody works for companies. They're very close about how they operate and what they do, and the word just doesn't disseminate in the same easy, fraternal way that it does in movies. So that's part of the problem, and so the expertise doesn't get known. You don't know that there's expertise, and that's part of it. The other part, of course, is that the games are much newer. This whole world started like 30 years ago, and that's kind of the start. So we only have 1.5 generations of people who have been doing this, and that's part of it as well. And actually a third factor. Movies are very hard to make. When you're actually on a set making a movie, it's the hardest work you'll ever do. But it's over in 6 months, and whoo, hey, I'm fine again, you know. And I made 3 different games that each one took more than 3 years. That's punishing work, and there are no unions in America. There are labor laws that force overtime. Not quite as liberal as Europe, but there are those rules. And so all the companies have been very clever. There's an exception to the rule, and the exception is that if you're a manager, and a manager, someone who is directing other people, is exempt from the overtime rules. So guess what? Everybody who works in a game company is a manager. And so you just work night and day for incredibly hard hours, and people burn out. That's what happens. And on top of that, I guess there's a fourth factor. The other factor is that there's been this tremendous technological advance that's been going on for now 30 years. And when I started, my God, my cell phone is like 10,000 times faster than the computer I used when I was designing Fate of Atlantis. And 3D came in the middle, and now you get these chips that almost look like movies when you look at these games. And each time there's been a technological advance, each time there's a new console that comes along with new capabilities, it destroys half a dozen studios who can't rise up to the challenge of doing this kind of work. And so there's been a consolidation of studios, and suddenly people are out of work, and so instead of doing video games, they're designing databases at hospitals.
That's very sad. So I know that even in this room there is successful people in the business of games. So you will, you know, some guys of the old school of Lucasarts, you will step up on an indie team if they came to you with the right project to give your wisdom and many skills.
Well, that's an interesting idea. How many of you guys here, by the way, are in the world of games? Hey, how about in the world of TV or movies? Okay, what about writing books? All right, good. Nice to find out. Say again your question.
You will do a job for an indie game studio?
Yes, well, I have done that quite. I spent 10 years being a freelancer, and there's a catch-22 when it comes to that. The companies that needed my services were too dopey to understand my advice, and the people who were smart enough to make use of me didn't need me. So that's part of it. And the other thing that's going on is, you can see from my hair color that I'm an old guy, and my career in video games professionally started when I was 50 years old. Scared the hell out of those kids. And so I'll give you an example. You know, I was a project leader, so I ran teams as well as a designer and coder and minor graphic artist. So I was one of the principals of the company, and one of the creative guys, but there was a group of people who wanted to be more creative that weren't being allowed to run projects or get their stuff, you know, made, because there's only so many games you could be making at Lucasarts at any one time. And they had a design forum that they had, and I was specifically invited not to take part. They were scared of me. They thought that I would come in and dominate everything and be terrible. And so that's another reason why. People do not respect age.
Nothing fulfillment. Okay. I was reading the first pages, and there is a beautiful scene where a boy with 9 years old has his first hint of the power of interactivity, speaking with Yoda. Yeah. So I want you to comment on this game.
About that a little bit. This is my latest book. It's only in English, I'm afraid. Fulfillment.
But this is my copy.
It's not the way to buy it here.
You can buy it in Amazon.
Amazon.
Yes.
Yeah. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, maybe Powell's, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's the one story I will ever do about the game business. And it's not about me. I was a mature guy when I got in the business. I knew what I was doing. This is about a kid, a lot like my colleagues at Lucasarts. But he's peculiar in that he's rather shy. He's lived a sheltered life as a kid in Chicago and nervous about everything. And he relies on spiritual advice at the beginning when he's a little kid on a little 5-inch statue of Yoda, who was a version of the magic 8-ball. And you could shake him a little bit and ask a question in your head and turn him over, and a little dodecahedron thing would float to the surface with some cryptic advice on it. Ask again later, or it's favorable, or whatever. And in Yoda's version, it would have his fractured syntax. No, it can it be it not, or whatever. So then when he goes to school, and in college, he invented a chatbot, which he called Master Ming, and he kind of knew about the I Ching. He's very interested in how randomness could come from the ether beyond our world and somehow offer advice to us. Now, the psychologist Carl Jung called it synchronicity, where when something you're interested in, some question you have about anything, happens to coincide with some weird I Ching answer, it kind of resonates in your head and clarifies a little bit of what's troubling you in some peculiar way. So anyway, this is a story about a guy who's going through life getting his advice from a chatbot. And in the book, I actually set forth the random number code that he uses, and it's real. Because when in Windows 10 or all the Apple products, or for that matter, the lotteries of the United States, they all use a random number generator called the Mersenne Twister, which is a funny name. But it's a very, very elaborate, very, very complicated random number system, and it's very good, pseudo-random numbers. Actually, it's interesting. In the world of lotteries, in order to get true randomness, there's a National Lottery Association in America for all the state that works with many of the states. And in addition to the Mersenne Twister, which produces the pseudo-random number, the seed is produced by the decay of americium-241 that you have in smoke detectors. That artificial element decays it unpredictably, and every now and then it shoots out a helium particle which gets detected, and they use that as a part of the seed for the random number generator. And of course our guy gets all interested in that. But he has a much more primitive random number generator, and has various ways in which he tries to make it work well. And I thought, I actually thought if I'm going to do a story about a guy who's a coder, I better show some code, and I did. And then I thought, I'm going to build that thing. So now you can go to my website, and if you've got a question about life that's troubling you, I invite you to go and talk to Master Ming, and he will give you answers to all your questions. Right on.
So the difference between us and many game developers is that we respect age, wisdoms, and masters. And I'm going to take one question, even if we are a little bit out of time, of you. So two questions.
I would like to ask a lot of things about that game that never get out, but I will try to just ask one. One thing that happened when everything closed at Lucasarts, previously Lucasfilm Games, is that there are a lot of intellectual property, very powerful, starting from Zack McCracken, and there Monkey Island, Manic Mansion, all were original, and in the little times where there was no solid, they were not original, like in the Endless Crusade. It has enough things that makes it different from the original film. Mm-hmm. And for example, Fate of Atlantis demonstrates that it was possible to create something new just in the video game, and it made possible, I think, that after that the dig became real.
Mm-hmm.
But then LucasArts closed and everything is disappeared. Why is that? Why we are not seeing those intellectual property coming
Use it
back?
again or coming back?
Yeah.
I think it still happens. By the way, George sold Lucasfilm to Disney. I think that was a very good idea because he has a lot of children that would never be able to run a company, and so thank God he's smart not to let them inherit it. It sounds like a James Michener novel or something. And anyway, but Disney, I have to say, actually got interested in some of these games. Some of them have been remastered, so they're still out there. Two of my games, Infernal Machine and Fate of Atlantis, are both on good old games. They've upgraded to the point where you can now play both those games on Windows 10. And so I like that very much. And I think as long as they're around, that there's some hope that they'll still have some influence. I don't know about some of the other games, whether Monkey Island has ever been put on good old games. I don't know. Fate is also on Steam. Nobody's interested in remastering, so we have the luxury of 8-bit graphics still, which is okay, I guess. Anyway, but I think that narrative has continued, even though the advent of EverQuest and multiplayer online games, the MUDs that turned into EverQuest and then World of Warcraft and then now Fortnite and Apex Legends, those kinds of games started to pull the imagination away from narrative. And all the younger kids that were coming into LucasArts, they hated things like cutscenes, they hated things that were narrative. At least what they thought was narrative was basically a chronicle of a sport. You know, when, you know, oh gosh, in the 87th minute, you know, just before stoppage time, you get a goal and they win. And they think that's a story. So, anyway, so I think there's still some influence there, because if you look at some games like The Last of Us, that game is kind of ugly for me in a lot of ways. It's a grim game and it's not a very humane attitude toward life. But it's very strong narrative. It's propelled by narrative in the same way that the old adventure games were. It's even got cooperative puzzles. You know, so I mean, you know, there's a tradition there that's still ongoing in some quarters. And every now and then a game like The Last of Us is very popular, so it still can work. But meanwhile, you know, hey, get on a bus, get dropped on an island in Fortnite and play Hunger Games, you know, and that's what a lot of people do.
But we have God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2 that are very influenced by the work that it...
No, I gotta say, I don't play Fortnite, and I do play those adventure games, and I'm a big believer in narrative, so especially narrative at the extreme, where you know, where the Hulu are coming to get us, you know, and I love all that stuff.
So, last question, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you for coming, and what I wanted to ask you is about some things you said. First of them is that games have a really beautiful part in the code and in the graphics that we can never see because they are in a closed industry. So I want to ask you if you would support the idea of liberating the code and the graphics of the good old games so that we can learn from them and to make the industry more open.
Okay. Well, the answer is probably not, and because you have to understand that the United States of America is the most litigious country on earth. There are more lawyers in San Francisco than the entire nation of Japan. So, okay. So right away, I can't liberate anything from good old games without having them come for me. So that's not going to work. I automatically liberate the stuff from anything like Master Ming. You just go up and you can look at the code. It's there. You have to know where your browser stores the action script. I mean the JavaScript, because it gets downloaded. It's not in the actual HTML, but you can find it. You know, it's right there. It's stupid. And a couple of the games that I've done in recent years involve Flash, and you can always detect the action script in that if you want. So I don't feel too bad about it. I think also, I just think part of it is a little bit like magic tricks. The reason why magicians don't want to reveal their tricks is because it's boring when you find out how they do it. That's what they don't want you to know. So, and it's a little bit like that with code. I know a young woman, an American woman, Read Code, has done some stuff here. And she talks about how the beautiful code that you do, no one will ever see. It's just your private, you know, art gallery. And I think it's going to stay like that. I mean, and she also mentioned something else, which is that even those of us who code, I'm a lightweight coder, I'm not an engine maker. But, you know, 6 months after I do something, I can't understand it anymore. I have to sit down and spend hours to be able to figure out what was I thinking about. You know, it takes a while. So it's a little bit like that. And I think that also it's like movie scripts. You know, Matthew's, I guess I'm the only audience for most of Matthew's stuff. Me and a few other people, because most of the stuff he does doesn't get made. But if I were to show you a screenplay, some people enjoy reading them, but the truth is, it's kind of abstract, it's a little bit hard to kind of get with it, and so most people just don't want to look at a screenplay, you know. So that's my answer.
So this is the end of Words and Bits, and this is the last panel with Hal, so let's finish with a roar.
Just finish by saying that I'm flattered and honored to be here with you guys. It's just wonderful. So, thanks for coming.
Pero